Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Myth Salon. Well, here we are again. Today, we have Dr. Connie Zweig, who has the dubious distinction of having two of the top 10 myth salons that we started producing. They have enduring quality. People love to come back to your material, Connie. And ironically, it kind of runs counter to the poem that I would like to read, which we run. We run. We cannot stand these shadows. Give us the sun. We were not made for shade, for heavy shade, and narrow space of stifling air that these white things have made. We run. Oh God, we run. We must break through these shadows. We must find the sun. It's written by Langston Hughes, who we both share the same birthday of May 22nd, so we're both Geminis. And I was struck by how you go across the stream and you think you have good footing on the stones that are going across, and you never know when you step on one whether you can go this way or go that way. And such as it is with finding a poet that you like, or finding a connection or a new friend, and suddenly your life goes in a brand new direction. So as we're coming out of COVID, almost seemingly forever, we're learning new ways to be with one another, new ways to connect, new ways to form community. So I'd like to start off with a moment of silence. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Myth Salon, where today we're going to meet the shadow, Dr. Connie Zweig. I'm going to turn it over now to my good friend and colleague in the Myth Salon, Dr. Will Linn, and he'll introduce us, and then we'll be off and running. Wonderful. Thank you. Will?
Thanks, Dana. Yeah, great setup with the poem. Definitely appreciate that. Setting up an arc, first leaving the shadows, like leaving Plato's cave, so that we can, for the entirety of our conversation, go back into them. It's awesome to be here, as you mentioned, with Connie. I think we've done this 3-4 with her now, with you now, Connie. And as many of you know, she's done so much in the background that as we help her bring out this book the best way we can, I just hope we can do the best we can for your work. Connie, thank you for all you've done for us. So now it's my opportunity, my privilege to introduce everybody. We'll get started with Connie, and then we'll all discuss. You know Dana White, host of Myth Salon, contributing faculty of Pacifica's Myth Degrees, and author of numerous volumes on mythology. I'm Will Linn, founder of mythhouse.org and moderator of our evening, host of a series for ZDF Sky and History Channel called Myths, the Greatest Mysteries of Humanity. We're joined as usual by our friend, Dr. Dennis Patrick Slattery, who is a distinguished emeritus professor in the Mythological Studies program at Pacifica Graduate Institute. Dennis is the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 31 volumes, including 7 volumes of poetry and 1 novel. His latest book is The Fictions and Our Convictions, Essays on the Cultural Imagination. His paintings, poetry, blogs, books, and upcoming events and trips can be found at DennisPatrickSlattery.com. David Chernikoff is with us for the first time tonight. David is a meditator, teacher, spiritual counselor, and life coach who taught meditation and psychology at Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado, where he has a private practice. Author of Life, Part 2, 7 Keys to Awakening with Purpose and Joy as You Age, David teaches workshops and retreats throughout the United States. He holds a master's in divinity and LCSW. Carter Phipps is co-founder of the Institute for Cultural Evolution, which addresses political polarization by focusing on the cultural roots of America's challenges. He hosts the Thinking Ahead podcast and is a former award-winning journalist and executive editor of What is Enlightenment magazine. Carter is also the author of Evolutionaries and co-author of Conscious Leadership. Dr. Aaron Kipnis is professor emeritus at Pacifica Graduate Institute and was core faculty from 97 to 2016. Aaron published a number of books and articles and lectured widely, including at UCB, Harvard Med, and Mythopoeic gatherings with Robert Bly. Aaron has been a teacher of transcendental meditation and has worked with spiritual, religious, and institutional trauma survivors as a depth-oriented psychotherapist. And finally tonight, Connie Zweig, PhD, is a retired therapist and co-author of Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow. Her award-winning book, The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, extends her work on the shadow into midlife and beyond and explores aging as a spiritual practice. It won the 2022 Gold Cover Award, the 2022 Gold Nautilus Award, the 2021 American Book Fest Award, and the 2021 Best Indie Book Award for the Best Inspirational Nonfiction. Her new book, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, The Dance of Darkness and Light in Our Search for Awakening, is available for pre-order now. Connie has been doing contemplative practices for more than 50 years. She is a wife, stepmother, and grandmother. After all these roles, she's practicing the shift from role to soul. Thank you for being with us, Connie. I hope you'll take us away and into the shadow.
Thank you, Will. That was a mouthful. The new book that we're exploring tonight is available to buy now. It's no longer on pre-order, so there it is. I just want to thank everybody for the privilege of your time, for coming to join us and focus on this topic, spirituality and shadow. I'm really honored to be with this wonderful group of men. And I'm going to start by giving a PowerPoint just to set the frame, because not everyone has read the book. And then we're going to have a conversation from our different perspectives with our different experiences, commentary, questions, and so forth. Hopefully a deep inquiry into this topic of why we're attracted to charismatic leaders, why so often they act out their shadows, how we can find practices and communities in healthy ways, and how we can recover from religious or spiritual trauma and betrayal. Okay, so here we go. So in every perennial tradition, the saints and the poets speak about the soul's search for the beloved, the seeker's yearning for the divine, for the self beyond ego. And this holy longing is a secret feeling with many disguises, leading us to pursue higher union in spiritual practice, religious discipleship, even romantic embrace. It guides us to timeless wisdom and transcendent experience. And it also can go awry when we project the divine onto a teacher, priest, guru, rabbi, or roshi who's all too human, who has unhealed wounds, undeveloped empathy, or authoritarian tendencies. In effect, a woman or man who has a shadow. And if he or she abuses power, whether the abuse is sexual, financial, or emotional coercion, we feel a shock of betrayal, our innocence is lost, and our faith is shaken. We may say he can't be enlightened as he claimed, or she has secrets and she's not who I thought she was, or the priest lied and the congregation was duped. In our time, we've witnessed many contemporary teachers of Buddhism, Hinduism, Hasidism, Islam, Catholicism, and Protestant groups act out their shadows in destructive ways, leaving followers traumatized and lost. Some of us tonight have experienced religious or spiritual abuse firsthand, and it's heartbreak and disillusionment. But we may not have had depth psychology and spiritual shadow work to help us rekindle the flame of longing in our souls. Daily accounts of the eruption of human shadow bombard us today in the social and political arenas, with darkness blocking the light, just as in an eclipse. Tonight, our focus together moves from the headlines to the eruption of shadow in a spiritual or religious context. We lived through a tidal wave of Catholic priest child sexual abuse scandals in the 80s that continues to this day. We live through social media and published reports of teachers in every tradition who claim the highest reaches of human consciousness, and yet who act out assault, abuse, and coercion in the extreme. But we continue to imagine a religious or spiritual life without an encounter with human darkness. Why do we do that? The Me Too movement went viral in 2017 to raise awareness of sexual violence in the workplace, military, universities, and other secular settings. It didn't publicly address abuse in the spiritual context. However, the movement also helped survivors and witnesses in spiritual communities to connect online, empower each other, and encourage whistleblowers to out religious leaders. Some all-powerful teachers could no longer control the narratives in their isolated kingdoms. Many fled the country. Some lost legal battles. In chapter 5 of the new book, I tell many tales of renowned teachers who fell from grace, some well publicized and others lesser known. And these stories of meeting the shadow on the spiritual path can lead us to feel that the darkness overshadows the light. When a group of Tibetan Buddhist survivors of abuse provided a document of allegations to the Dalai Lama, it was called Me Too Guru. It's evident from my research that we need a spiritual justice movement, but only 13 states have penal statutes that support the criminal prosecution of clergy for sex with a congregant. From childhood through late life, many people long for God, spirit, transcendence, a sense of the divine. When you imagine God, what do you see? A stern, bearded male perched on the throne with angels circling his head? A beatific Madonna with an innocent child at her breast? A black four-armed goddess dancing on a corpse? Indra's net as it weaves through and interconnects all things? The letters of a holy name? A colorful mandala? A sacred mountain? Or a sparkling void? Each religion comes with its own images of the divine, and they may inspire awe, love, fear, guilt, shame, doubt. In some Eastern traditions, they're objects of contemplation, evoking spiritual qualities in the aspirant. Many of us here in the Myth Salon have studied Carl Jung, and we know that he explored the God image in myth and in the psyches of his patients. For me, the God image is the hidden object of desire, typically hidden in the unconscious shadow, but pointing towards something beyond ego and arousing our holy longing. When we find a sacred teacher or spiritual guide who evokes our soul's longing, our image of God leaps out of our inner world onto the idealized human being, and we're filled with exalted feelings of devotion in the presence of our ideal. In our psyches, the teacher, priest, guru, rabbi, roshi, lama, sheikh, has realized in human form the ideal other living within the student, the image of the complete self-realized human being. And so in the inner world of the student, the teacher carries the student's own highest authority. The parent who won't fail him, the godlike human whose attributes she strives to emulate. For the student to recognize the teacher as such, there must be a match between the inner image and the outer person. The arrow of projection hits the target, and the student feels a fit, an inward yes. Jung called this an archetypal projection, distinct from a parental projection. He uncovered through a patient's dream that this patient was turning him into a god. And like her, we're unconsciously attributing godlike status to spiritual teachers. Once activated, this projection holds a promise and a duty, an inspiration and a burden. On the flip side, the teacher basks in the admiration and devotion of the student. In some cases, teachers unconsciously come to emotionally depend on this adoration, like food. And so they behave in ways that exact obedience from their followers. With a lack of moral development, they act out their shadows in destructive ways. So what would lead us, many of whom are independent, highly developed adults, to endow another human being with so much power and authority that we feel blind faith? Our tender longings activate vulnerable feelings of childlike devotion. And each of us carries unmet childhood needs into adulthood, such as an unconscious longing to merge with a powerful figure for protection against frightening feelings of powerlessness and abandonment. So we're susceptible to the vagaries of human authorities who appear to be benign. We know from Jung that archetypal projection is hidden beneath and behind the parental projection. So let me quickly review what this is, just so that we're all on the same page. Through projection, the shadow or unconscious mind expels both positive and negative traits by attributing them to other people and disowning them in ourselves. Each of us carries a kind of archer's quiver on our backs, and every so often an arrow shoots out unpredictably. Oh, that person is so stupid, or that person is so wise and compassionate. And so we may begin to surrender to a teacher, and our early needs to feel special, to be seen, to keep secrets, to feel belonging are hidden, but they're all at play. Some of us seek teachers like our parents, and others seek teachers who are different. But in the unconscious, the shadow has its own agenda. People may meet teachers who seem at a conscious level to be different from their parents, but later, when the shadow erupts, they discover he or she is a lot like a parent. A teacher may appear to be gentle and compassionate, but when he's angry, he becomes a critical know-it-all, just like a woman's father. Or when he begins to gain wealth, he becomes a materialistic consumer, just like her family. Or when his sexuality isn't processed, he begins to seduce women with promises of enlightenment, urging her to keep his secret, just like family secrets. We know as students of depth psychology and myth that we can't reduce our stories to psychology alone. Myths across space and time include a time of descent, an initiatory moment known as catabasis, when the hero is forced to go down below the ordinary world and face an enemy, a monster, a dragon, in effect, a shadow figure, before the return to the ordinary world. I found this theme in Mesopotamia, Mongolia, Egypt, Finland, Wales, India, Greece, Japan, and shamanic cultures. Think about Jonah in the belly of the whale, or Theseus going down to meet the Minotaur, Inanna descending until she's naked and raw, Orpheus descending to retrieve his true love, Gilgamesh crossing the waters of death, Persephone kidnapped and taken down to Hades, and so many more that I'm sure Dennis will elaborate for us. And in films today, we see all kinds of symbolic undergrounds, caves, subways, tunnels, doorways, volcanoes, that tell us a descent is taking place, or a dangerous crossing. But there's a threshold to cross and a gatekeeper to meet. And during this time, the protagonist is in doubt, fear, isolation, alienation. It's a time of trial, where she meets allies and enemies, where she loses precious attachments and gains precious gifts. And I know that Will can elaborate on this in film. So this describes the experience of those suffering spiritual betrayal and abuse by a teacher. We long for the divine human. We fall into an archetypal projection. We feel a resonance, purpose, belonging, specialness, and then we're suddenly stripped of our faith, our friends, our beliefs, our practices, wandering in the darkness. In this arena, perhaps you have witnessed covert abuse, a look of contempt, a hypocritical act, or you experienced overt abuse, emotional coercion, or sexual violation, and you made the descent. Our teachers, even when awake in advanced stages of consciousness, are still human and not perfect. As a teacher's ego becomes inflated, surrounded by adoring followers in the props of a lineage, he or she may come to feel the right to sit on a golden throne and increase authority without limits. Using power to serve the ego's agenda, the teacher's danger grows. Soon he doesn't have power, power has him. And it becomes an unconscious complex, acted out on the stage of the most sacred arena of life. Power and sex go hand in hand. An incursion may be careless or aggressive, subtle or traumatic. But many teachers and clergy use sex to express power, intimidate others, and feed their own emptiness. In particular, a culture's deeply ingrained traditions of misogyny and objectification may engender in male teachers a shadow that allows them to use women, men, girls, or boys as objects for their own gratification. The high-profile cases of the Me Too movement reposed questions about power and gender. Who has the power? Who has consent? Can someone consent if her career, education, mental health, financial well-being, or in this case, spiritual well-being, is controlled by the person who desires sex? Can she consent if she's told she'll be excommunicated, her family will go to hell, her karma will be damaged for lifetimes? And like sex, money can become the ego's tool, the root of all evil and the grail we seek. It also carries the projection of divine energies and can be worshipped like a false god in the form of a sleek private jet, a shiny Rolls Royce, or a golden throne. Financial coercion can be covert, beginning with tithing, and it can lead to overt abuse when a teacher demands access to a student's income or inheritance. The reports of so many teachers living lifestyles of excess, in contrast to their teachings and those who serve them, are deeply disheartening. Some teachers have claimed that salvation or enlightenment lies in giving them sex or money. They promise that these gifts will carry their followers to heaven or to higher stages of consciousness. And the broken promise is devastating. So I just want to go through briefly the patterns that I found, regardless of denomination. These incidents have all of this in common. A priest or teacher exploits others for his own narcissistic needs. The transgressions are boundary violations. The member chosen for abuse is made to feel special. Others enable the abusive behavior. Members deny their own feelings, doubts, and intuition. They seek to maintain the projection at all cost. They rationalize hurtful behavior. Shameful secrets glue the system together. And members are threatened with retaliation for disclosure or for wishing to leave. When I sort of detected these patterns, I realized how much it sounded like the patterns of an alcoholic family. So how do we begin the inner work to help us recover from these traumas? At some point, a student or believer can no longer tolerate being the subject of overt shaming or sexual violence, can no longer tolerate being the witness of hypocrisy or coercion. The moments of choice come and go as he calculates the risks of staying and the risks of leaving. And it's a tense and challenging period filled with fear, confusion, guilt, and loss for anyone, whether in a church, synagogue, sangha, or zendo. If she can break through denial and begin real self-reflection, the gifts from the descent will be revealed and the true return can begin. Not the return to normal conventional life, as cult experts like to say, but the hero's return, renewed and transformed. So here are some questions to start the journey. And this is in the book. If you don't, you don't have to do anything with this now, but let it wash over you. Reflect on your role as a student or believer in relation to a teacher. Are or were you obedient, dependent, repeating family patterns? What did you project? And what did you repress into your shadow? Have you given away your spiritual essence, your light? Have you projected your spiritual authority? Have you projected certainty and banished your doubts to be with a teacher or buy into a belief system? Have you accepted others' definitions of moral behavior and spirituality? What do you need to reclaim your critical thinking? And, you know, I'm going to add here for David, because both he and I work with elders, that in the later stage of life, how are your spiritual beliefs affecting your feelings about who you are and about your own mortality? How have you cultivated a spiritual persona that narrows your range of thinking? What's your biggest fear of reclaiming your feelings? What do you need to feel safe to reclaim your feelings? Do you believe the impulses of the body are dangerous temptations? Which bodily sensations have you forbidden? And what would happen if you began to allow them to arise? What do you need for that to feel safe? If we've sacrificed our capacity to question authority and think critically, our capacity to feel deeply and honor our feelings, our capacity to detect bodily cues of danger, and our capacity to sense our own spiritual power, then we may become passive and submissive, even childlike. Have you become passive, giving up action in your own behalf? Are you unable to feel or express doubt or questions? What do you need to act in your own behalf and reclaim your agency? And what do you need to separate from an abusive relationship or community? A fortunate few find the narrow path through the darkness and undergo an initiation. We travel from spiritual innocence through the dark descent toward a new level of consciousness, spiritual maturity. We evolve from dependency on a spiritual parent through meeting the shadow towards spiritual adulthood. Having been emptied out of ideas and images and left fallow for a dark season, we become fertile soil for new life. Open but not naive. Eager but not impatient. Ripe for blossoming. With practice, we learn to meet the darkness in ourselves and in our teachers, gradually coming to accept it as part of being human, but no longer susceptible to its abuse. We may be able to see our own shadows, accept our limitations, and empathize more deeply. For some people, this inner work requires separation from a teacher and community. For others, it requires becoming a whistleblower, but staying to reimagine and redesign the group. And I tell several stories about that in the book. In the end, shadow work for spiritual abuse and disillusionment requires that we reclaim lost parts of the self and permit new feelings and images to emerge. That we reclaim all that was sacrificed as a projection onto a teacher because our capacity to carry our own greatness was diminished. And it's now expanded to contain it. With this new stage of awareness, the hero crosses the threshold to return home with a boon, a new insight, or a new stage of awareness. I'm calling for a reimagination of religious and spiritual life that expands to include the human shadow. It's not absent in anyone, and it's not going anywhere. It's a part of the spiritual path and a part of the human journey. But it's not the whole story. The human soul's longing for transcendence, awakening, the divine beloved, is the central mystery of a human life. And for some of us, it's purpose. To follow our longing, we must ask, what is spiritual integrity? To me, it means living with the awareness of our interdependence with all life. So the need for compassion for all living things. If we don't have the direct, non-dual experience of interconnection, we can hold the knowledge of it and act accordingly. And this includes inner work on our own moral development, which is neglected in many traditions. It includes speaking and behaving with honesty and transparency, not secrecy. It includes living with congruence. We do what we say, not hypocrisy. It includes personal shadow awareness and taking responsibility when our shadows act out. So this is the dance of darkness and light in our search for awakening. If you're interested in reading the book, I'm offering an invitation to anybody here tonight who's interested in doing spiritual shadow work with community support. I'm forming free online leaderless groups to read the book and do the practices together. So you can shoot me an email, conniezweig@gmail.com. Put spiritual shadow work in the subject line and be sure to give me your time zone. And I will connect you with other people to form a community to go through the book together. Please don't send me long emails because I get way too many emails. But if you'll put that in the subject line along with your time zone, I'll be really, really glad to connect you and offer support to do this inner work. Okay, thank you so much for listening. Okay.
Wow, Connie. That was amazing. That was really fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, that was inspiring. I'm sure many of us have all kinds of thoughts and questions, and I know I do. You brought a couple guests specifically with you that are new to us tonight, in Carter and David and Aaron, and I want to turn to them and ask if any of them have anything that they would like to start with.
I'll jump in. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I appreciate that that Connie is kind of raising this issue and writing about it. I just think it's an issue a lot of us have been through in our lives, and how we negotiate it, I think, has been, often in the past, it's been negotiated through the lens of sort of, someone was part of a cult in some form, and then that's a whole kind of worldview in and of itself, and being able to understand your experience in such a way that also deeply affirms the spiritual longing that sort of led all of us to pursue these paths in various ways, and really affirms that very deeply, and yet is able to look at that in a bigger way and explore it in a richer kind of context, is so important. And there's a lot of elements of what you said that allow us to do that. And I just think, as we mature as a culture, we have to find ways so that we all approach this conversation differently. It's not students' faults, it's not teachers' faults, it's not even these communities' faults. We all kind of approach this differently and begin to mature in how we engage these modalities and communities.
That's really important to me, Carter. So let me just riff on that for a minute. I know David wanted to say something. I'm really want to emphasize the complexity of these issues and the nuance and the identity crisis that results, because people are so deeply identified with their beliefs and their practices and their teachers. From my point of view, this is not about making wrong, and it's not about good versus evil. And there are some horrific stories There are some disturbing allegations, in every tradition. But my effort was not to point the finger. It was to try to understand why. Why is this happening? What are the systemic issues? What are the psychological issues in the teachers? What are the psychological issues in the students? How do we change these dynamics? So thank you for seeing that.
What strikes me that's so important, Connie, about what you've done with this book is that any issue of this kind, it seems to me, has to be named before it can be addressed. And the calling out and the naming of the issue, which has been talked about at points in the past, but not in as clear and direct a way as you express in the book, feels to me to be a very important step. It reminds me of when John Welwood, a well-known transpersonal psychologist, pointed out in 1984 a process that he labeled spiritual bypassing. And it's related, obviously. But I think when he named that, for those of us in the transpersonal psychology community, we had something to work with that had been there for many years, but had never been concretely understood in such a way that we could now work with it much more effectively. And I have that same sense.
Yes. Will you explain what that is, David, in case people don't know?
Well, the way Welwood talked about it, and others as well, spiritual bypassing essentially is the misuse of spiritual teachings and practices in such a way that they end up serving the ego rather than dissolving our identification with it. If I had to give it in a sentence or two, yeah. It could have to do with beliefs, it can have to do with practices. It's a kind of self-deception that even the most experienced practitioners fall into from time to time. And part of the maturation in spiritual practice seems to involve recognizing when we've fallen into that sand trap and making amends at times like that with self-forgiveness and through self-compassion. And as Tibetans would say, turning poison into medicine by making that a valuable teaching.
So for me, because I began meditation at age 19, I really believed that it would solve all my problems. Mm-hmm. And then I believed it would solve the problems of the world and we would have an age of enlightenment. And so that's just kind of a really obvious example of spiritual bypass.
I first got involved as a 21-year-old undergraduate with yoga and meditation. And my understanding was quite simplistic in a certain sense, in that I believed that there was a straight trajectory from where I was to the end of suffering. And the more I practiced, the sooner that would happen.
Right.
And I didn't understand the nuance and the spiral nature of the evolutionary process that later came into my understanding as the months turned into years and the years turned into decades.
Well, we're talking about spiritual bypassing. I wanted to ask, is there something that's happening where the student's projection is projecting onto a teacher's persona, but the teacher, if they're a guru, in denial that they have an inflated ego, maybe even kind of denial of a persona, then that projection, the student projection, instead inflates something that they're in denial of. So because they're in denial of their persona, when it's being projected upon by the student, they're actually thinking, oh, they're not seeing my persona, they're seeing my true self. So instead, that full projection of the students as spiritual guru, instead of them thinking it's landing on their persona, they're letting it land on their inflation of what they think is their true nature or something like this, but in an unconscious way.
They start to believe they're press.
Yes.
Right.
Well, and there's an identifiable skill in that regard that has to do with understanding how to work with projection in the same way that a psychotherapist has to work with transference and projection. But in the case of a spiritual teacher, it's times 10 or 100 in many cases.
Or 1,000,000 if it's Sai Baba. I mean, yeah. So you imagine carrying that much projection of millions of people.
Mhm.
It's very intense.
Is there something where, like, I mean, I was a department chair and I was the only full-time person in my department, right? So in my department was the only academic department in the arts college. So I'm the only full-time academic. And I'm just looking at this like, oh shit, this is a setup for, whatever. And I'm teaching mythology and spiritual transformation and all this stuff. So I feel these projections coming at me, and all I want is out of it because it's kind of for multiple reasons. But one of them is this, for sure. You feel it is almost threatening.
How did it feel threatening?
I think that narrative structure you just described of kind of killing the guru, and I almost think that is a pattern that's in the student, regardless of teacher. And that the student's transformation in student's journey is going to include killing the guru at some point. So I don't want to sign up to be that guru for these 18 to 22-year-olds I know, like, all this projection, all this love now, all this elevation now is going to turn, it's set up. And I know it's not all mine anyway.
So it was about killing you off.
I didn't want to set myself up for that. It's like,
Right.
I wonder if almost that's the trap for the teacher that gets seduced into going head first into all that, because they're going to get the other side. They're going to get this happening. This will happen to them eventually.
Since we're with the myth people tonight, I want to take this off in a slightly different direction for a moment. I think the hero's journey, it can take us to the Grail Castle, but it's not the mechanism by which we enter the castle and begin to interact with the Grail. That part of the journey isn't on the map. And there aren't really, and nobody is the gatekeeper but your own heart. So at some point in the journey, at least within the journeyer, the spiritual hierarchy is completely crumbles. It's dismantled in that light of direct cognition. And so then it's just the cognition that's the instruction, and anybody else who's talking about it is some kind of a colleague on the path. So there's no gurus. There might be other workarounds, but I think the only workaround ultimately around spiritual abuse is to awaken.
So let me see if I understand what you're saying. What I'm hearing you say is the awakening or the direct perception is non-conceptual. And at that point, there's no map and the teacher becomes irrelevant.
Yes.
That's what you're saying?
Yes.
So, one of the things I've been struggling with since I've been researching this material is how many people now are saying they're awake and popping into these, the states of non-duality or states of direct perception or states of higher stages of awareness or whatever their language is. The Buddha at the gas pump has interviews now with almost 700 people who say they're awake. And many of them are becoming teachers. And there's something for me really dangerous about this, because there is no map, and because they believe they no longer need guidance or supervision, and to use a clinical term. And so for me, it's kind of, and Carter, I'd love to hear from you. It's thrown the definition of awakening into chaos for me when I listen to these people. It's like the Tower of Babel. Everyone is using the same language and meaning different things. They think they're in the Grail castle. They found the Grail. They're ready to teach, and they're acting out their shadows in really destructive ways. Some of them, obviously, not all of them. So what do we do with that? I mean, there's something very exciting about it. And because in the midst of the darkness of the political scene and the climate crisis and all the crises that we're wrestling with, all these people are waking up. There's a spiritual resurgence happening at the same time, but it feels, what's the word? Slippery. It feels slippery.
Yeah, it's like they reportedly, someone asked the Buddha once, what was more important? The Dharma, the teacher, or the Sangha? And reportedly Buddha replied, the Sangha. What is the Sangha? Well, they're your companions on the path. Not higher or lower. Everybody perceives things differently. And if you're in the Sangha, people keep you straight.
But
If
most of
you're
these
not
teachers,
possessed by a complex or some part that isn't integrated, then you lose your non-dual experience, which I'm not sure is possible, but it could be. But say you're gripped by the shadow, to use the language of the evening. The Sangha keeps you straight.
But Aaron, all of these teachers I wrote about do not have Sanghas. They
I
have
know,
no,
that's the problem.
they're isolated
not
without
accountable.
peer support.
I'm accountable to you and everyone else that I'm playing with.
One of the ways that's been addressed in the Buddhist world, particularly in the insight meditation communities, is setting up teacher councils.
Ah,
So if you look at Spirit Rock or you look at the Insight Meditation Society, there's no primary teacher. Jack Kornfield, for example, was very intentional about not choosing into that role when Spirit Rock was created. And the teacher councils function in just the way that Aaron was describing for other teachers within the Insight Meditation community. And not by accident, in both cases, those councils have created very clear and specific codes of ethics for behavior of teachers. I believe you included one in your book, Connie, if I
yes.
recall correctly. Yeah. So there's certainly something to be said for the way in which accountability can be co-created amongst a community of teachers.
I'd like to jump in with just a couple of things. I'm so glad that several of you were speaking about the nature of beliefs. As I continue to think about myth and beliefs, I've come to the place of thinking that beliefs are the infrastructure of the myth that we're living in. And it's like the spine of a book. It holds all the pages together, but lets the pages be independent. And so belief is essential to the mythological imagination. The other piece is, and this is for any of you, because Kai, your book couldn't have been published at a riper time in this Tower of Babel. I think that was your term. And here are the three pieces that I sense have intimate relationships with one another. And I'm speaking it because I don't know what that is. And the three are fundamentalism, fanaticism, and innocence, or perhaps better said, pseudo-innocence. And part of the grip of some to hang on to that sense of innocence is to project that shadow material onto any passerby that they feel they can get away with. So I'm really interested in that trinity of fundamentalism, fanaticism, and innocence, and their relation to shadow projection.
Carter?
Yeah, I was going to respond to your earlier point, Connie, but then Dennis got me sort of interested in this one. So now I'm just like,
Go for it.
but I think the nature of fundamentalism in any community is fascinating. I mean, I remember in our own community, we used to, especially in the later days, we sort of say everyone went through a true believer phase when they first got involved, and they didn't really get that interesting as sort of students who were more independent until they kind of got through that phase. And that was always a big challenge to get through that phase, a bit. And a lot of people never got through that phase. They'd sort of leave before they did. And that's its own interesting kind of dynamic. But I was also going to address this thing, and I'm being interviewed by the Buddha at the gas pump next month. So that's interesting you brought that up. This idea of non-duality and awakening becoming so sort of embedded in the culture today, and everyone and their dog has had mystical experience and non-dual experience, and that's fine. That's all well and good. And I think, like you say, there's something very positive about that. But I still think like non-duality and the perennial traditions in some ways have sort of enshrined this idea of that kind of experience of being a kind of pinnacle of human development in a way that still lives very strongly in the way we think about the spiritual life. And being able to understand what it is I still think we're sort of immature in how we think about it. I always say, don't turn the ground of being into the goal of becoming, And I think that there's a lot of that still. We're still working through a lot of that as we understand what the nature of enlightenment ultimately. I spent a lot of time thinking about that question and its role. And I think I saw in my own community and with my own teacher, like how the mystique of enlightenment, like it got its hooks into him and into our community to some degree. And it was very hard to remove those hooks. It's like and fully transform how we see this, so we could all kind of come into a different mature phase. So I do think it's a longer conversation, but under like deconstructing the mystique of enlightenment a little bit and trying to mature out of that kind of an older version of it is really important in this process.
Really important. That's really, in some ways, that's a bedrock here.
Connie, I think we're talking about several different kinds of communities here. And one of them is when you talk about people who are on the path towards awakening, once you start down that path, it kind of forks off into all kinds of other things. And I think the problem in our culture doesn't stem from too many people on that path. It starts from a lot of people burying their heads in the sand. And we live in a culture of fundamentalists that are seizing control of a lot of the mechanisms that we use. And those same people realize that there are opportunists and opportunities in these educational and spiritual communities. It's like it's good for business. And if you happen to be in the business of fundamentalism, you're going to find a farm. You're going to find a place where you have clients. You're going to find a place, a business where people gravitate to you. One of the things that I think that has happened is that in times past, our heroes didn't necessarily need to have morality or a moral tone, but we expect our heroes today to have morality. We expect them to be decent people and have ethics. And so we're really fundamentally, to use that word, we're really disappointed when there is this fall from grace about our leaders and people we had depended on, and when they go through these crises that affect us, doesn't allow or legitimize them coming after us personally, but we feel violated. But that might not have happened 100 or 200 or 500 years ago. These people got away with this stuff because it was the nature of the power structure.
So you've broadened the meaning of fundamentalism, I think, to include fundamentalist thinking about anything, not just religious fundamentalism. So from a depth psychological point of view, I would kind of explore that as unconscious identification with principles or beliefs. that we may not even know are running us.
Mhm.
I mean, we all see that with the Supreme Court now. We see it acted out right in front of us with the court. But it seems to me that maybe it's a stage of development in humanity. And part of what, for me, the meaning of enlightenment implies is that we're free from attachment to or identification with our beliefs. We're not run by our mind, by the contents of consciousness anymore. So whatever the beliefs are, they're kind of floating through. And that is a completely different experience than I am my cognitive structures or the content of my beliefs. And I think that's where most of our country is right now. And that's one of the reasons for the polarization. But it's very unconscious.
One of the things that surprised me a little bit as a depth psychologist, who's also, I had a meditation practice for 55 years, was that, and working with people who are experiencing states, is the hierarchical notion that there's some kind of omega or perfection or something like that. Experiencing possession by what you might call in this context immoral acts or shadow, possession by the shadow. How can that happen in an awake person? And it's one of the conundrums we're chewing on today. And so are a lot of spiritual abuse survivors. It's confusing. It's like being abused by the parent that you trust. It screws you up. It's betrayal. Betrayal trauma is like one of the worst forms of disruption of the human psyche. When you put your trust in another and they're sort of even housekeeping sealed, and then they betray you. How can that happen with someone that's awake? And I think this is what depth psychology has to offer. And I can't say I really understand it, how these possessions happen in an awakened state. But as a depth psychologist, that's what we understand. And James Hillman was very adamant with his point of view that which we fail to commune with tends to possess us. And so it seems to me that part of awakening is understanding this nature of the psyche and working with it, because it isn't automatically solved by transcendence. It isn't dissolved by transcendence. So that's just a kind of curious wrinkle in time.
Ken Wilber has two contributions to that question that I like, Aaron. You may know this already. One of them in Religions of Tomorrow, he said that shadow material is lodged in the subtle body in our chakras.
Something like that, yeah. In
our lineage, Vedanta, we call it the remains of ignorance. So if someone is in a advanced stage and yet acting out some shadow material, let's say sexual shadow, it could be that is unresolved second chakra issues.
Lesha Vidya,
remains of ignorance, or power shadow, third chakra issues, right? And the other suggestion that he made, which I like, and both of these are discussed in the book, is that the lines of human development are not, our development, psychological and spiritual, is not global. We don't wake up and become an intellectual genius or an emotionally literate, relatable person. We wake up in the spiritual line of development. And some people who may have attained some of that may be emotionally very undeveloped and morally very undeveloped. We've seen that in geniuses in many fields where people are cognitively advanced, but really, emotionally retarded. And so that helped me to understand, to kind of discriminate between these kinds of development. And maybe that's part of what's happening, Aaron. So someone has advanced spiritual development, and I saw these people in India, and they clearly have Shakti, they clearly have powers, but they can't relate as human beings. They don't necessarily have empathy or communication skills or, the sort of human stuff that we come to expect in the West. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's how I'm thinking about it.
Connie, would you run through, or somebody, what you're referring to as chakra issues? So if somebody has first or second chakra issues, what that actually means, and then maybe take me up to that place of enlightenment. I don't mean to take the discussion somewhere, but we were using that as a platform to make a point, and it just seems that that would be good to at least have that out and talk about it for just a few moments.
The root chakra, the first chakra, is about survival, right? So it connects us to our sense of ground, to the earth, and to survival needs. The second chakra is about, it's not only about sexuality. I wish I had Neil here. He's watching. He's such an expert on this. So if there's sexual shadow being acted out, and all these allegations of assault and seduction and coercion around sex, it could be, there are cultural issues around that also, right? Some people are coming from monasteries into this kind of libertine Western culture. There are all sorts of there are layers of issues here, but it could be that also that they were molested. There is the young Kali Rinpoche. Did you hear this, David? The young Kali Rinpoche, who's supposed to be the incarnation of the old Kali Rinpoche in Tibetan Buddhism, has said that many young boys are molested in Tibet in the monasteries. So, yeah, shocking, but kind of explains why some teachers might act that out, because their own traumas were not fully processed, right? Third chakra is more about, this sort of popular understanding is power, but it's about agency, autonomy. Fourth chakra is about connecting to humanity, compassion, higher forms of love, self-expression in the world, intuition, clairvoyance, spiritual powers, and awakening. Does anybody want to add anything to that? So
That was really nice.
Yeah, it's just a brief map. So you can see that with that map that you could get stuck in any of those, you could get pockets of shadow in any of those places, and that it might be triggered in a particular context. And that kind of, for me, helped to explain why teachers might be vulnerable or susceptible. And sometimes there are two people in it. It's not just the subject, object, survivor, victim situation. Sometimes it's even consensual. There are people who marry their teachers. We don't know what the power dynamic is in those marriages, but that does happen. There are women who say that they weren't traumatized by that situation. So that's why I'm saying it's so complex. Anyway, is that helpful, Dana?
I really appreciate that, because when I entered into this community, not being a psychologist, I found there was a lot of insider language, and there's a level of understanding that seemed to permeate the culture. And so when I come up to a moment, I'm thinking, I don't totally understand what you mean by, chakra possession or influence or that sort of thing. And so in a way, I just felt like I might be acting as a voice for somebody else who might not understand it as well.
Yeah, that's great.
I think another conceptual perspective on the Tower of Babel that you talked about, Connie, and trying to get some sense of understanding of what people are meaning by words like enlightenment and liberation and God realization, is the work that Danny Goleman and Richie Davidson have done on the difference between state changes and trait changes. Right? That's a very helpful perspective, because some of the people who are being interviewed on Buddha at the gas pump have clearly had states of unification and realization and dissolution of the ego. I don't doubt that for a moment. However, the extent to which they've integrated that into their personality, the extent to which they've actually cultivated the traits associated with being a more fully realized being, is a wide open question. And I think that's part of what generates the confusion, because for some people, sudden enlightenment, there's a dream and an imagination that says it's forever.
Yes.
And there's not a recognition that that door pops open like a screen door on a spring at times and then slams shut. And we find ourselves working in the darkness again. And that's that spiral nature of the process that I think sometimes requires us to do a lot of personality related work and healing on the personal level. And then we move back into the transpersonal level and continue to move and grow in a spiral dynamic of that sort. That's why I prefer the word awakening to enlightenment generally, because it's a process word. It's not a noun.
Yeah.
I remember Buckminster Fuller writing a book years ago called I Seem to Be a Verb, Not a Noun. Yeah. So that's just some other ways of thinking about this that I've found helpful, trying to sort it out for myself.
You know, David, to that point, in the analysis of the dream seminars, 1928 to 1930, where Jung is working with, I think, two other analysts, and they're taking one dream after another, and it was all transcribed. But at one point, Jung is speaking about the rhythms and laws of nature, and then he says, all psychic development is spiralic. We're always folding back on ourselves to where we once were, but we can never land on that place. He says we land a little bit above,
yes,
or a little bit below. But the implicit piece there is that, yes, but we can get back in the neighborhood. I can't get back into that house, but I can get into that neighborhood. So it just reminded me when you were twice now, you've brought up the spiral, which I think is I think Jung is onto something profound about how the psyche develops. And it requires that folding back and then coming forward again, and then folding back and coming forward again.
Yeah, on a number of occasions in my own clinical work, I sat with people who said things to me like, I can't believe I'm working on my father again. Right? You know, I thought I was done with that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And they didn't understand what you're pointing out, that move, they're not seeing it from the same place.
Yes.
They're doing the next level of work that they're ready to be doing.
Yes.
And
you know, Dante's Divine Comedy, he invents the terzarimic rhyme scheme, which is A, B, A, B, C, B, C, D, C, always recapitulating forward in that paradox that I think psychic and emotional development captures. So Dante, I think, was a depth psychologist a few years before Jung.
Yeah,
Dennis,
well said.
Do you want to add anything, Dennis, from literature and myth?
Oh, yeah. And so I mentioned to Connie and the others that were present about 10, 15 minutes before we started tonight, I just started to write down what have I read that's still in the memory? Flannery O'Connor's short stories are magnificent poetic expressions of shadow material. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is a marvelous study of how projection works. Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich. These are some titles that came to me. Toni Morrison's Beloved is a magnificent study of the white imagination projecting its stuff onto an entire race, which then dehumanizes them so that they can be bought and sold, abused. Sandy and I, my wife and I, have been rewatching after, I don't know, a decade or two, The X-Files, and speak about shadow material in the monstrous and the things that come up out of the sewers and the things that come out of the sky. In terms of films, The Green Knight is a wonderful expression of shadow material, as is Tender Mercies, if you remember that, and also The Banshees of Inisherin. These are all projection shadow films that are really rich to go back to. And then, Connie, you mentioned Gilgamesh. I had that one down. And of course, Inanna's Descent and Jung's dropping down from the spirit of the times to the spirit of the depths, where he realizes that unless he kills the heroic in himself, he's never going to be liberated. And then, you know, tragedy itself as a genre is always about breaking some boundaries down. And often the price tag is very high. But what is the consequence is some new space has been opened up for something new to grow. And I know these are these are patterns that I've noticed in teaching many of these works over the decades. And of course, Odysseus' descent into the underworld, where he gains that knowledge that he can't go home without, as Circe has guided him into that region. So those are a few
Thank you.
works that are just rich in the conversation that we're having tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I wonder if anyone wants to tell a personal experience.
I'd be willing to, but I don't want to be speaking too much. So I'm a little hesitant, basically. Part of what I think comes into play here, Will, you talked about your concern about what would happen if people projected onto you too much, right? What you also might want to recognize, and this is something that I experienced that I'll talk about, is that there's an opportunity there for you as a teacher to teach people how to take back their projections. And that is an incredible service in terms of serving that person's growth process. Yeah. One of my experiences with this whole notion of the shadow of the spiritual life had to do with Trungpa Rinpoche, who was one of my early Buddhist teachers. As I mentioned earlier, I first got involved with teachings as an undergraduate student, initially in the yogic tradition with Swami Satchidananda, who came over to New York in 1966 originally. And I was very taken with meditative and yogic teachings of Hatha Yoga and the lifestyle associated with it. Then I moved out to Naropa University when they opened in 1974 to study the Bhagavad Gita with Ram Dass out there, and then decided to stay in Boulder and live there. So at the time I was, it was, as some of you know, that summer was like a miniature Woodstock, basically. The planning committee planned on, I think, 200 to 300 people. And it turned out to be more like 2,500 people who showed up for that summer. And among other things, I got involved in a relationship after training as a yoga teacher and being celibate for a couple of years, and then deciding to get involved in relationship again. And it was an incredible ascent, which was fabulous, actually. And of course, what goes up often comes down. And as a 24-year-old, I had my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces when this relationship ended, at which time somebody gave me a copy of Trungpa Rinpoche's book, Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, which was a life-changing experience for me, essentially. After 5 or 6 years of being deeply immersed in a theistic-centered perspective as a yoga student and teacher, I stepped out of the theistic view altogether into a Buddhist perspective. And I thought the book was frankly brilliant in many ways. Yeah. So I went to Trungpa Rinpoche and I got involved. I took meditation instruction. I took refuge and bodhisattva vows, got involved with the community. The relevant part here is that about 1.5 years into that, I started to feel as if the community was going off the rails from my perspective. And at the same time, because Trungpa Rinpoche came from what was called a crazy wisdom lineage, there was a lot of rationalization about what was happening. There was a lot of reinterpretation of events that was a little crazy making for me as a young person. But because all of my friends and my social life and my spiritual life revolved around the community, I felt confused and really starting to suffer. Yeah. For about 9 months, I felt incredibly judgmental of all of what I saw going on in terms of alcohol use, Trungpa Rinpoche sleeping openly with students who were married or not. There was no hiding about it. That was kind of actually refreshing in a certain sense. But I struggled, and I felt intense judgment of the teacher and the community. And then eventually, Joseph Goldstein wrote his first book in 1976 about insight meditation. I read that book, and one of the central principles was that anyone who wants access to higher wisdom has to build it on a foundation of ethical behavior. Absolutely has to do that. Yeah. And that's when I said to myself, I don't need to evaluate this community or this teacher. I just need to know this is not the right path for me. At which point I went on a retreat with Joseph. I got involved with the insight meditation tradition, and it became a kind of spiritual home for me. But the sense of intuition and trusting my own inner guidance that I experienced in that transition was a major part of my spiritual maturation process. Just one example that comes to mind.
What a beautiful story
Yeah.
of your actually trusting yourself and having the courage to separate.
And a personal telling of a story that many of us know a little bit about and may even be in the back of our mind throughout the evening. So, thank you for sharing that with us. I think many of us, Crazy Wisdom came out when I was in the Myth program. So it was in the conversation with all of us. I wonder about one of the things that happens in these situations. I wonder if it's like, Twain had this thing where he says, I can't say his quote, but it's like scholars, what they think is right, they're right about, but what they think is wrong, they're wrong about. It's the thing that they know they're right, but the thing they think other people are dumb about, they're off, right? And so I wonder if it's almost like something similar where you identify with what you are, but repress what you're not. So if the spiritual teacher is identifying with something excellent and with the spirit, they can grow that spiritual excellence. But I wonder if as they grow that spiritual excellence or whatever it is, if that transcendence becomes a disidentification. Is transcendence, is the path towards transcendence also a psychological journey of disidentification from that which you're transcending? Are you trying to transcend the material, but then actually you're just disidentifying with the materialism in yourself, and then it comes out as a materialistic shadow. You're trying to transcend the sexuality, but you're just detaching from your own true sexuality, and so then it just becomes unconscious and shadow.
Yeah, I think this is part of why shifting states can actually be not a joyful experience, but actually what Trumpa would have called a complete catastrophe. It's been interesting to me how some of my old friends who have been reoriented in their state experience over time are surprised when what we're going to talk about my father again comes up, and other repressed contents of the psyche. And I think that's the importance of some depth psychological knowledge about kind of the composition of being human. And without that, and without ethics and a moral ground, it's an archetypal possession, possessed by the light, if you will. But nevertheless, it's not about becoming a whole person. Becoming a whole person is a work. It's a lifelong work. It's an alchemy. And non-dual awareness, there are many other kinds of states in between, is part of it, but essentially we're human. And if you lose that, then you're disassociated, not transcended. It's years ago, Wilbur talked about the pre-trans fallacy. Right. So that's what becomes in play if you haven't done your homework on your humanity. Haven't really worked with the wounds of the emotional body and all of that we do in psychotherapy. There's an old Vedic expression that as the light gets brighter, the shadows get more defined, sharper, like that. But again, I think it comes if you have a communitas that can kind of see it. And you can see it in yourself without disassociating. It's self-awareness, facing yourself as you are, as you truly are. And then I think there's a capacity to have a work where you actually can express that, the truth of your existence. But Connie, stop me. I just think there's a lot of clearing that might need to happen for that expression to come out in an elegant way.
Aaron, we often have this conversation about the value of psychological work.
Yeah.
And emotional, psychological development versus value of transcendence and spiritual development.
Yeah.
And how much are they in tension, and how much are they aligned? And how much can I value, one in myself if I feel inadequate in the other one? I think that's a really important issue for people. I also want to respond to David. Trungpa was brilliant. My God. So was Rajneesh Osho. So was Adi Da, right? Their books are genius, and their behavior was atrocious. And so once again, we come back to that question, how can this be? And what is enlightenment or awakening?
Well, it's what you said, Connie, earlier about lines of development, right? That someone has had profound spiritual experiences and realizations associated with them doesn't in any way necessarily imply they've integrated that into their very human personality and psychological history. Mm-hmm. And people in Eastern perspective would say karmic history as well. Okay, right? So another way to think about enlightenment that I've been playing with recently is to think of it more in terms of becoming what I would call fully human. Mm-hmm. In the sense that if being human includes in it an innate capacity for self-transcendence, then when we become fully human, we also can experience self-transcendence while also fully owning and embracing our human side as well, the relative and the absolute in that language, right? Tibetans would call it the conventional and the ultimate, right? But Ram Dass used to talk about this frequently, as I think many of you know, right? That learning to stand on two levels of consciousness simultaneously rather than sequentially was how he understood spiritual maturity. That is, having your primary sense of identity being with true nature, or whatever of the terms we choose for that, and having that identity with true nature infuse the way we live on the relative level as a human being with our vulnerability and our frailty seems to be a viable vision of spiritual maturation to me.
Yes, beautiful vision.
I very much appreciate the kind of the acknowledgement, the sort of like, you know, the states and traits, as you were saying, David, and states and stages, and you know, and you know, like trying to get our arms around this kind of, you know, more kind of human picture of development or spiritual development. But I want to flip it a little bit and also like acknowledge here, or at least I would suggest, the kind of the opposite question of what Aaron was raising, in the sense that Aaron was raising in the question of like, how does transcendent, how could a you know, how does, you know, someone who's deeply transcended in some form or deeply realized a non-dual state or a disassociated state, however we say it.
Right.
But what I want to say is I think we also, and the necessity obviously to do a deeper form of work and to not assume that's the top of the mountain or whatever we want to say, or whether or not there is a top of the mountain. But there's the other side of it too, which is that I think I want to almost flip it and say that when we see someone who is extraordinarily charismatic and has an unusual capacity of awakening and has usual capacity to transmit that awakening, you might as well just start thinking about what kind of trauma they experienced in their background. I think it's the reverse. You know, that kind of awakening, not always, not in every case. You know, there's a million types of awakening and there's a million types of teachers, but many select, but there's certain types, you know, and I think it's a question that needs to be explored further. Select for instability in the self. That's not a bug of their awakening. That's a feature. That's why they are there, you know. And you know, certain types of trauma in the self is what is the very vehicle of it's the vehicle. It's the, you know, I think when you, and again, and we shouldn't I'm not even saying we should condemn that, you know, or maybe it's a beautiful form of genius. We shouldn't just expect it to be something it's not. You know, that may be a beautiful form of genius expressing it through someone, and maybe they're transmitting their particular background of whatever trauma or whatever it was and maybe it's come out in this new way but we shouldn't then expect an integrated whole, you know, personality that, you know, in the way that we, so it's almost flipped to the opposite side. Like we should almost expect there to be non-integration, but it doesn't mean we can't, but there can be a compassion and appreciation for maybe a unique form of awakening or genius that is expressing itself. But I do think there's something in the, you know, in certain types of neurosis, and this is probably an avenue for a lot more psychological research and exploration, certain types of neurosis and trauma, just like, you know, people who study like paranormal phenomenon will sometimes say that, you know, certain types, you know, you get hit by lightning or you have sexual trauma, you know, and you can become more psychic or more paranormal things happen to you. It's like the self retreats deeper into some other non-physical layers of the self and is able to access other places. You can understand how that can happen. I think the same thing can happen with non-dual realizations or all kinds or different spiritual realizations. So I just think it's part of the picture. It's part of the complex picture of enlightenment, of awakening, and we need to kind of embrace that to help us understand it. Not just condemn people who have it. It's like you say, Connie, some of these people are geniuses and they're contributing in tremendous ways, but we get into trouble if we start to think it's something it's not, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I want to build on what you're saying there. The big difference between gods and humans and myth is that gods are by definition not the other archetypes. You know, Zeus is not Hera. There's zero Hera in Zeus. There's zero Aphrodite in Zeus. That's the point. Zeus is just Zeus. We as humans are supposed to be what has it all inside of us. And so but at the same time, who is better at sounding like Zeus than Zeus? Who is better? So that imbalance is what we see on TV. There are no integrated people on TV. What we see on TV are people that have extreme enough experiences and perspectives to have clear voices. They're like, by definition, like the deities, out of balance. And so it's almost like you wonder if, of course, it's the person that is running from darkness because of trauma that hides in the light and ends up having all that darkness. I don't want to be reductive in who achieves enlightenment or something like that, right? And who is awakened or that it's all only from
that's
trauma.
a big picture, right?
But I do think there's something there. Was when something creates that imbalance, because the imbalance on the other side. They were pushed so hard into the dark, they swing so hard into the light, identify so strongly in the light, then they can speak clearly from that perspective of light only. And then you hopefully, well, you know, is Siddhartha ever gonna drink that bowl of milk and stop going down that ascetic path to the end and start integrating the milk, start integrating the material and the body and the relationship with Mahamaya and the tree and the earth and all that stuff, which I think is, I want to say, so I don't sound like I'm somebody putting Hinduism or Buddhism up there as just a leave it all behind path. I don't think so. I think inherently Buddhism is fundamentally, it's in the myth. It's pointing towards integration. It's pointing towards drink the milk and love your body and love nature and love the world. But I think what you said just really inspired me. I think the imbalance is part of the feature.
I'll add one brief thing to that, as you said. Thank you. You know, like, look, I just think even teachers I think of like, I was the Eckhart Tolle. The vehicle for Eckhart Tolle's enlightenment was a suicidal ideation, right? You know, or at least a major vehicle. Byron Katie, same thing, right? You know, again, those people are contributing. They're teaching ways that are helpful. I'm not condemning them at all. I just think, like, let's understand that whole picture too. You know, I saw it with my own teacher, and in a different way, not quite as dramatic, but
there's something that can happen in psychotherapy with people who are, you know, dedicated to kind of shifting their state of consciousness. When they begin to disidentify with who they thought they were. From a DSM-5 clinical point of view, we start to see that as disassociation. And then if it goes further, I mean, Dogen said that enlightenment is intimacy with all things. Well, experiencing yourself as interconnected with all things, it's a different idea than experiencing yourself as the Aaron Kipnis or the Connie Zweig show. So the sense of I, or the sense of identity, it shifts its locus. And when it does, the who we thought we were-ness loosens. But I think, and I'm coming back, this is something I touched on before, but it's where I'm struggling, that there's something autonomous going on in there too.
Say more what you mean by
well,
that, Aaron.
When you no longer believe that you're solely the game that you were playing, the identity, your education, your breeding, all of that, cultural, religious, all the identities. Not that you're not that, but you're not only that. You're also something else. That can become the dominant location. That's the dangerous point where you disidentify with your humanity, which is very different than developing a kindly and compassionate view towards your mortality and your failings and your broken parts and your shadows.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can't live in the world openly or live in the world of others openly with those parts, you can become possessed by them. And that's when you become a spiritual abuser in this case. Or if you're a psychotherapist, it's when you start abusing your clients instead of helping them along the way. you become predatory. It's the nature of possession. It can't, it's like cancer. It can't feed on itself. It has to feed on its host. Am I making any sense, or am I just off in the weeds on this conversation? I don't know.
No,
This conversation is amazing. Thank you.
no, I don't think you're off the mark at all. I don't want to come at pretty much what you're, I think what you're saying through literature, through poetry. And, you know, the Greeks in their wisdom, and Aristotle gives voice to the term mimesis, that, you know, when we read a classic of literature, which could have been published last Thursday, there's the plot of the story, but below the plot, but the plot leads us to that deeper mythic action that is the action of the soul, and it infiltrates the soul of the reader, who, if that reader is not reading for analysis and mastery, but reading openly and is porous, that it can dislodge a fixed sense of who one is if one meditates on it. I mean, I think these classics of literature are for contemplation, not analysis. And that mimetic sense opens us to some universal quality of being a human being. And it's been my therapy for 60 plus years, that reading these works or reading a poet that you love opens, and it cultivates an elasticity in us that maybe without it we couldn't become elastic. So that's another angle, but Aaron, I feel like we're speaking about the same thing, just coming at it from maybe different disciplines or different modalities.
Except that you had the capacity to phrase it so much more eloquently and beautifully than I ever could.
Oh.
So thank you, Dennis.
Thank you.
So-
You inspired me to say what I said, so we're working together.
Connie, I have a question for you if I can get to. Is that okay?
Yeah, can I say one thing, Will?
Yeah.
So we're kind of working in this interconnection between mythology, psychology, and spirituality. And trying to uncover how they shape and color each other.
Mhm.
And I think one of the questions, you know, Carter, you kept saying you don't want to judge and you don't want to put people down. You were hesitant to psychologize, which I honor. I'm not so hesitant myself. I don't want to reduce things to psychology, but I'm not as reluctant as you. And one of the things I found in this research, which was so disturbing, is there has to be personality disorders, serious personality disorders in some of these teachers.
Yeah.
There has to be narcissism and even sociopathy in some of these teachers who appear to be without conscience.
Yeah.
And maybe in response to what you're saying, in some ways that makes them susceptible to expanded consciousness.
I think we have to consider that.
And borderline personality makes us susceptible to expanded consciousness because the boundaries are so porous. And so some of this sort of examination of the interconnection of these fields seems important, just to understand what awakening is.
If you can slip into states very easy, you're not as an integrated as self. I mean,
That's-
that's a very, that's,
Well
know,
said.
and
Well
I just
said.
think that's, you know, and again, what part of the condemning, I think, is I want to get out of the, like, you know, they're perfect, they're horrible. You know, I'm trying to get out of that
Yes.
polarity.
Yes.
You know, kind of.
Yes.
Well, human.
I hear you. So let's hear from Will, because
Well, exactly. Speaking of the condemning, you know, Connie, you're not exactly one to condemn the shadow all at the end of the day. So that's my question for you is we've spent most of this conversation identifying what the shadow, like the shadow work here and maybe criticizing it, but is there like, what about the Zen master who you find in the back when he's finally willing to let you see him smoking his cigarette and drinking his whiskey? We don't think of that as the example of the one abusing the power. We think of that as the example of the one who kind of is aware of their own play, aware of their own joke enough to be, I don't know, are they doing something positive with the shadow? Is there something that a guru, like, okay, shadow's there, now what? Can we romance it? Connie, is there something positive to do with this shadow to transform what it's doing for us or doing to us?
Well, there are examples. I don't know if you want to talk about your teacher, Carter, but there are examples of teachers who are now self-reflecting, who are actually learning about their own psychology, who are trying to make amends, who are trying to redesign the systems that supported their bad behavior. There aren't too many of them, but there are some. And so I think there's a beginning there, but most people in those positions, it seems to me, carrying all that projection, gathering all that power, building all that wealth, they become very invested in what's in the game. And they don't really want to look at themselves because the game for them is spirituality, not psychology, not self-reflection. My brother-in-law went to Kripalu when Yogi Amrit Desai was found to be having sex and he was married, and all the scandal kind of shattered the community. And he worked with the staff. They brought in Marion Woodman, they brought in consultants and therapists, and they redesigned the system. They did romance the shadow. Same with the LA Zen Center, which is a beautiful example. I think he was like 100 years old, right? Maizumi Roshi, and he was found to be having sex with all these women, and everything just erupted.
Sasaki Roshi.
That's a different one, the more recent one.
Oh,
Anyway, yeah. Anyway, so yeah, there were several. So anyway, what happened was a female Roshi took over, and she actually taught people shadow work. She taught, not my method, but she taught people how to cultivate shadow awareness, how to meditate facing each other instead of facing the wall, how to destroy the hierarchies that they had instituted there, how to increase service. It's a very service community-oriented Zendo now. So there are people doing these versions of that's really inspiring, but mostly it's not happening.
Well, I'm inspired at least to get to hear a positive note about it, and maybe at least examples to grow, hopefully there's increasing cultural awareness, and that the systems that have enabled these things are coming down and maybe even the systems, out of their own desperation to save their personas, will start turning to the good examples to follow.
We'll see.
Ram Dass used to tell a little story about visiting his brother in a mental institution.
Yeah.
And he came to see him, and his brother said, I'm Jesus. And he said, I know. Ram Dass said, I know. I'm Jesus too. And his brother said, no, you're not. I'm Jesus. And Ram Dass said, that's why you're in here and I'm outside. So I think this spiritual hierarchy we're talking a lot about and its components, it's co-created. No followers, no guru, right? If the guru is enlightened, then I'm not. In the tradition I was in, which was the transcendental meditation of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and in that organization for some decades, people who were having transcendent experiences were better not to talk about them openly, because didn't want to put on any airs, around the only enlightened person in the room. It was both implicit and then at times explicit. And then in the last couple of years of his life, he allowed his students to really talk about tell the truth about what they were experiencing.
Isn't
There's a
it-
kind of liberation in that, coming out of that dualism of being in the student-teacher complex. If the student can liberate themselves, it deflates the inflation of the teacher. And the more they project on the teacher, as you were, I'm sorry, you're pointing at the screen, as you were alluding earlier in the evening about wisely eschewing getting possessed by that role, because it's a dangerous position, but it's fueled by the devotees.
There's probably not time to spend too much time on my particular story, but yeah, I think I spent a lot of time, and myself and some of my fellow students spent a lot of time trying to develop a culture in our community that would be, and to some extent we did it with our teacher, and to some extent we did it in spite of him, and ultimately he failed we couldn't do it because of him. But we spent a lot of time trying to, because part of the original ethos of our community was a lot of like, we don't want to make the mistakes of the past. And that partially came from the teacher, partially came from all of us. And so we tried consciously to do that, but it's a lot harder than you think. It's like, it's easy to say that, it's easy to try, but there were deeply embedded ways of thinking that inhibited that, and ultimately he was the inhibitor. And but it was hard to get him to realize that, and it was hard to work with him. And even as the community matured in so many ways, it had this pin on it that couldn't go further. And it's like, cultural evolution of all kinds. Sometimes it's hard to make things better without making them worse at the same time. It's like,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
ultimately, as we tried to make things better and better, we came up against something, and ultimately that come up against something you have to come up against it with such force that everything broke. Everything broke. And then, of course, he figured out that actually maybe it was his fault, and he's been on a journey since then, and that's another issue. But yeah, it's but I felt like part of what kept us maybe from being able to break through and it was, we weren't as mature as we should have been. He was certainly not as mature as he should have been, but it was also the cultural conversations around us, didn't maybe lend themselves, and the ideas about what we were doing didn't lend themselves, I think, as richly to the kind of conversations we needed to have. And I think that's why I feel like if anything with these things, I'm trying to, there's a lot of different ways to play this. There's a lot of different ways to try to evolve this conversation.
Yeah.
But so I appreciate Connie's book, and I appreciate all of it. You can do it at the student level, you can do it at the teacher level, you can do it, but also the culture level. The kind of conversations we're having about spiritual awakening are so important, I think. As we have a more mature understanding, it will help people as they deal with these issues in their own communities.
Thank you.
Connie, thank you. Thank you very much for bringing this whole thing together. It strikes me, not to be simplistic, that what we really are seeking is a balance between head and heart. And a lot of people get their egos fueled, and the whole idea of trying to feel a part of your community is keeping in touch with your community, allowing your heart to be in there and not get so wrapped up in yourself that you forget what your original reason for coming there was, or following this path of awakening.
Well, I would say it a little different. I would say it's about discernment, shadow awareness, or discernment. Yeah. Because if we're discerning, we will be in touch with our heart, but we'll also be in touch with our gut, our body, our intuition, our instinct. I had so many people tell me I knew it was dangerous and I ignored the red flags. So discernment, really, really important message. And also, Dana, I just want to reiterate my invitation to people. If you would like to do this work in a group, they're free, they're online, please let me know.
Well, thank you. And all of this will be on the tape when we put it on there. I'll have that information out there. Aaron, Dennis, Carter, David, and Connie.
Thank you,
I
thank you.
thank you all so much. Rather than say more, let's say less. Let's go out with a moment of silence. Thank you all so very much. Aaron, it was great to see you again. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
All right. Good
Thank
night.
you.
Connie put together a
Appreciate
great
it. Thanks,
group.
Connie. Take care.
Thank
Thank you,
Thank you
thank
all.
you. Good
Bye
night.
all.
Good to
Thank
be with
the
you.
audience. Yes. Bye.